Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Nandita Correa, and on behalf of the Charles Correa Foundation, I would like to welcome all of you to this conference. It's a little odd to be addressing you online. As many of you who've attended our earlier conferences know, we usually fill the Color Academy auditorium in Panjim, Goa, with about 1,000 people. So there's always this wonderful buzz in the hall as we begin. And strangely, here too, even though we are virtual, since we have been logging in from all around the world, it's another kind of energy. We have been able to reach so many who could not have traveled to Goa. So thank you and welcome. This pandemic has reached all of our communities. Confined to our homes and walking in our neighborhoods has led us all to focus on the more immediate spaces around us. We see space in the public realm with fresh eyes. We see problems more clearly. We see what is accessible and what isn't. And most importantly, we see what can be changed. As architects and planners, as urbanists, we need to step in and bring about that change. Z-Axis 2020 centers on the question, how do we improve our own neighborhoods? In each session of the 4 consecutive Saturdays that follow, we have speakers who will present their projects, which of course reflect their professional skills and rigor, but have been so successful because they have worked with the community, the neighborhood, the stakeholders. We will look at approaches from Beirut, the barrios of Buenos Aires, and an ambitious park in Cairo, where the projects intervene at the scale of the city. The following Saturday, we moved to a slightly smaller scale, the neighborhood park in Amsterdam, community organizing in Buj, and the Medina in Fez, the largest urban pedestrian network in the world. Next, we will move to the scale of the streets. The streets in most Asian cities, as you know, are dynamic with street vendors, tons of traffic, pedestrians, two-wheelers. How do we keep the energy, the vitality, and yet design them to be safe? There will be presentations that look at influencing policy, implementing projects, and engaging people's participation. And finally, we come down to the scale of the dwelling and we'll look at private space in the public realm. It is so important to understand and respect these spaces because they play a unique role. They are the interface between our private lives and the neighborhood, especially with the restrictions imposed during the pandemic. We'll see projects from Beijing, which are wonderful design solutions to this interface of private and public. And we will end with a closing keynote address with a marvelous project, one that I do not believe has been shown in public before. It's an institutional building that, through its very form and site, becomes the connectivity that the people of Barrio 31 need to link them to the jobs in the city. So again, we use our skills as architects to make our communities and our neighborhoods better places to live. After these 4 Saturdays, we move to the design challenge, where we will recognize and award creative individuals and teams who will bring change at each of these thresholds. The Charles Correa Foundation will receive, select, and support proposals aimed at transforming and improving neighborhoods for their residents through the evaluation of a jury. And so, over a period of 4 months from now until mid December, we will work together towards making our neighborhoods more livable. So, let's begin. The title of this conference, You and Your Neighborhood, really comes from Charles Correa's master's thesis, which he did in 1955 at MIT at the age of 24. And today, as we celebrate his 90th birthday, we thought we'd show you the film. We have a 16 print, and Charles wrote, animated, and photographed this 10-minute film. I'm told that the Housing Association of Metropolitan Boston approached Professor Kepish with funding for a film, and Kepish asked Charles if he'd be interested in making it, knowing that Charles loved films. So Charles got to combine his two passions. Well, if you know Charles, he loved toy trains too. So, but you'll see in the opening shot, he starts with an aerial view of Joe's house and changes perspective as the camera pans up to see the skyline of the city. His classmate and friend Rhoda Braun told me recently that the faculty were very keen, taken by his thesis. It was the first time a film was submitted as a thesis at MIT, and that it discussed people's participation and urban rehabilitation as opposed to urban renewal, which is what was being promoted at that time in the 1950s. The film advocates for Joe and his neighbors to get together to form a neighborhood association. And instead of abandoning the neighborhood and moving to the suburbs, it recommends staying in the city and fixing their neighborhood. It makes the case for citizens participating in planning before this was popular, at a time when the state was calling all the shots. It is moving to see how this resonates even more powerfully today. So let's run the film.
This is a house. This is an old house. This is the house where Joe lives. Joe has lived here many years. Things have changed around him. The town has grown. There have been new houses, new schools, new office buildings. Yet somewhere along the way, Joe's neighborhood has been lost in the shuffle. It isn't as nice as it used to be. Joe isn't very happy about it. He wonders what has happened. Was it the neighbors? Was it the factory? Was it himself? Actually, there are many reasons why Joe's neighborhood is run down, and Joe's guesses aren't very far off. It was the neighbors. It was the factory. It was Joe himself. But these aren't the only reasons. When Joe moved here, it was a nice place. Everyone looked after his home. It really wasn't anyone's fault in particular that things got bad. It's just that everyone started paying a little less attention to their property. And the worse things got, the less they cared. Oh, a few people did try to clean up. There was no use. They soon gave up. The railroad didn't help any either. It brought noise, it brought dirt, it brought danger to the children. So did the factory. Gradually, Joe's neighborhood got worse and worse. The streets became untidy. The sidewalks cracked. The lights broke. Inside, the houses were no better. The walls peeled. The stairs sagged. The plumbing leaked. The refuse gathered in the gutters by the parked cars and in the vacant lots. Newspapers, tin cans, and broken bottles. The children had no place to play. Some of the neighbors sold their houses and moved away. They went to newer sections of the city. Joe thought of moving with them, but then he decided not to. He wanted to be near his work and near his friends, so he stayed behind. Joe looked at his home, and his yard, and his neighborhood. He realized something must be done about them. But what? It wasn't just Joe who had worries. It was the whole family. His little girl, and boy, and wife, and mother-in-law. They were all unhappy. They all wanted something else. The little girl wanted a yard she could play in, with swings and seesaws, away from the danger of the traffic. The wife wanted a garden, not a dirty old backyard like the one she had. She wished the sun would shine, so that she could have her garden, free from smoke, free from soot. The boy wanted a youth center, where he could go swimming, play games, and meet his friends, and have something to do on a Saturday night. The mother-in-law wanted a shady spot where she could sit and talk to her friends. The whole family wanted a place they could go for picnics and outings. Not way, way out in the road, snarled up by traffic, but right near their own neighborhood, so that they could really enjoy it. Was all this possible here, in this neighborhood? That day, Joe called on his neighbors. They must all get together. They must decide what to do. They had their first meeting. At last, something was being done. But not everyone was so enthusiastic. Some of the people said it was useless. It was a poor neighborhood they lived in, and it could only get worse. It was silly, they said, to improve your house when all the other houses continued to be so shabby. Pretty soon yours would be the same way again. Alas, they did seem right. But then suddenly Joe got an idea. What if they all fixed their houses? What then? The better things got, the more they would look after them. They would simply reverse the cycle that had spoiled their neighborhood. So many things could be done. Those broken stairs, cracked walls, and leaky plumbing, they could all be repaired. And in the neighborhood, those empty lots, they needn't be full of weeds and broken bottles. Why, they could be places for children to play. Well, yes, someone said, but what about the uncollected refuge and the trash in the gutter? It wasn't their fault it was there, was it? Was it? Joe wondered. How could anyone clean the streets with the cars in the way? Move the cars, and it's easy. The same with the rubbish. It shouldn't be left outside hours before it was to be collected. It was bound to get knocked over. The correct way to do it would be this. They must all come to an agreement with the pickup man to put the rubbish out just before the truck came along. That way, everything would be clean and neat. Of course, Joe said, for this or any other part of the plan to succeed, we must all work together. Luckily, he added, that's where law enforcement comes in. Up in City Hall, we have a health department. They send inspectors around to check. If conditions are below the housing code requirement, the inspectors will have them corrected. Well, okay, someone else said, but what about the factory and the railroad? What can we do about them? Before Joe could answer, Jim, who worked in the factory, jumped up. He knew the answer to that one. It was simple. Right now, it was true that the smoke from the factory filled the whole neighborhood with soot, but they could do something about it. They could use a smoke preventer. The important thing to remember, Jim said, was that they needed the factory. They needed the railroad. The factory gave them jobs, and the railroad gave them transportation. They should always keep this in mind. After Jim finished speaking, everyone was very enthusiastic. They all had many ideas. Some said, Roofs would be patched, property painted. Others thought they would install new toilets and central heat in their houses. The whole neighborhood would be cleaned up. Sidewalks would be repaired, streets properly lighted, trash and litter put back in their correct places. When an old house was torn down, it needn't be replaced by another. Perhaps the land could be used as a tot lot where the children could play. Pretty soon their neighborhood would be spick and span, as fine a place as when they first moved in. But how could all this be done? They must get together, just as they had done tonight, not just a few, but everyone. Together they would form a neighborhood association. Together they would work to make their neighborhood a better place to live in. What Joe and his friends are doing is good not only for them, but for the whole city as well. Right now there is far too much waste in the growth of our cities. Suppose this orange square represents a city. What happens when a neighborhood goes bad? It is immediately replaced by a new suburb on the outskirts. This happens again and again. This is how a city grows. But this is very wasteful. If we do want additional housing, why don't we rehabilitate some of the areas that are slipping right within the city? Instead of abandoning and moving on, we must stay and consolidate. We must reverse this cycle of waste. Look around our neighborhoods today. They needn't be the way they are. They could all, every one of them, be fine places to live in, places we could be proud of, if we'd work, like Joe and his friends.
Well, let's hope that our competition teams meet with similar success as Joe's neighborhood did. I'd now like to introduce you to today's speakers. First, Swarnabh Ghosh, who will give the Remembering Charles Correa Lecture, followed by Mirai Chatterjee, who will deliver the Memorial Lecture, and Ranjit Hoskote, the discussant. Ranjit Hoskote is a contemporary Indian poet, an art critic, and cultural theorist, a cultural activist, and a curator who has brought us over 20 exhibitions on contemporary Indian artists and was the curator of the first ever professionally curated National Pavilion of India at the Venice Biennale in 2011. He has published several books on his poems, and in 2004, at the age of 35, he was honored by the Sahitya Akademi with a Lifetime Achievement Award. Mirai Chatterjee, who will give the memorial lecture, is a social worker who leads the Self-Employed Women's Association, or SEWA, as more often referred to. She joined SEWA in 1984 and was its general secretary after its founder, Ela Butt, retired. SEWA is now about 50 years old, and in these 5 decades has accomplished the most amazing results working from the ground up with women's groups. Mirai is responsible for SEWA's healthcare, childcare, and insurance programs, as well as its health cooperatives. And among many national and international appointments, she was the commissioner of the WHO's, the World Health Organization's Commission on social determinants of health. Swarnabh Ghosh is a PhD student at Harvard University and is working at the intersection of critical urban theory, geography, environmental history, science, and technology studies. His broader interests concern the historical geographies of urban capitalism and the political economy of urbanization from the 19th century to the present. He was trained as an architect in India and the US And before coming to Harvard, he practiced in New York for several years with the interdisciplinary studio Diller's for Video and Renfro. I was introduced to Swarnabh through a paper he had written where he argued that Charles had been influenced by Buckminster Fuller. Bucky had been visiting professor at both Michigan, where Charles was an undergraduate, and at MIT, and Charles had taken a studio with him at both schools. He was very influenced by Fuller, by his philosophy, and the two stayed close friends until Fuller died in 1983. It was pure serendipity that I came upon Swarnabh's paper for just a few weeks before I was rereading a book on Fuller, where it said that he had asked for his tombstone to be inscribed with the words, "Call me Trim Tab." Fuller had written, "Something hit me very hard once, thinking about what one little man could do. Think of the Queen Mary. The whole ship goes by, and then comes a rudder. And there's a tiny thing at the edge of the rudder called a trim tab. It's a miniature rudder. Just moving the trim tab builds a low pressure that pulls the rudder around. Takes almost no effort at all." So I said that the little individual can be a trim tab. Society thinks it's going right by you. That it's left you altogether. But if you're doing dynamic things mentally, the fact is that you can just put your foot out like that, and the whole big ship of state is going to go. So I said, "Call me Trim Tab." This conference has developed from the fundamental principle that all of our citizens should act as trim tabs. Now, I'm excited to hand the Remembering Charles Correa lecture. Thank you.
Hi. I'd like to start by just thanking the organizers of Z-Axis, and in particular, Nandita, for the invitation to deliver this lecture. I'm also particularly pleased to be speaking alongside Mirai Chatterjee and Ranjit Hoskote, both of whose work I've admired for a very long time. Could I have the presentation, please? So I'm going to read out most of my presentation just so I can keep to the time. Okay. On the 13th of November, 1969, the American architect and inventor Buckminster Fuller delivered the third annual Jawaharlal Nehru Memorial Lecture in New Delhi. With characteristic urgency and enthusiasm, Fuller made a plea for generalization. Specialization, he said, tended to shut off the wideband tuning searches that were required to discover all-powerful generalized principles. In 2020, it is easy to recognize the ubiquity of this position. After all, the notion of designers as generalists has regained popularity in the design disciplines over the past 2 decades. However, in the context of 1969, when the still newly independent India was in the midst of massive state-led economic planning, agrarian development, and industrialization, Fuller's words were particularly resonant. Buckminster Fuller was well known for his quasi-religious faith in the emancipatory potential of design, and he would often express this through stream of conscious writings, truly long marathon lectures, and a prodigious stream of proposals and inventions. He fervently believed that scientific rationality and technological innovation could empower humans to overcome the social and environmental challenges of the 20th century. For him, design entailed a radical flattening of knowledge into a system of associative thought that would ultimately lead to the discovery of universal principles. This metaphysics of universality, however, did not, and indeed could not, accommodate politics, social relations, or cultural conventions. A feature of Fuller's technocratic disposition that is considered one of its biggest limitations. At the same time, Fuller was perhaps the first spatial thinker to develop a vocabulary as well as a heuristic that could operate from the scale of the household to the scale of the planet. So here on this slide, you can see on the left an early set of drawings for his famous Dymaxion house, and on the right is also an early diagram of a project that he called the Air Ocean World Town Plan. And you can see sort of it is this settlement that sort of wraps around the whole planet. The height of Fuller's fame, so this is probably the height of his fame, coincided with the onset of the Cold War and the space race, as well as the beginning of the global environmental movement of the 1950s and 60s, a period whose contradictory dynamics are best represented by this iconic photograph, the blue marble, taken from aboard Apollo 17. This image inaugurated, in the words of Sheila Jasanoff, a new era in human self-perception, as the direction of the human gaze, which had hitherto looked up from the earth, was reversed as it looked down towards the earth from above. Fuller's work is best understood as both a product as well as an emblem of this historical conjuncture. A famous manifestation of Fuller's planetary ethos was his Dymaxion map, which was born of his conviction that the Earth was best apprehended as an interconnected ecological totality. He wrote, "I study the local problems of any one man and place them in respect to the larger scale total information and its derived theory of life." End quote. To do this, he said, required developing a minimum set of essential concepts and current information, which could lead to operating our planet Earth to the lasting satisfaction and health of all humanity. End quote. Consequently, the Dymaxion map represented the world not as discrete continents separated by oceans, but as a nearly contiguous landmass in which the territorial units of post-Westphalian sovereignty were rendered unrecognizable and indeed irrelevant. In his influential booklet, Operating Manual for Spaceship Earth, Fuller made explicit his disdain for the territorialities of nation states. In it, he wrote that despite our recently developed communications intimacy and popular awareness of total Earth, we, in 1969, are as yet politically organized entirely in terms of exclusive and utterly obsolete sovereign separateness. While the Dymaxion map was an attempt to reorient conventional understandings of the relationship between the Earth's landmass, its oceans, and the territorial boundaries of nation states, the geoscope represented the next stage of Fuller's cartographic experiments. Initiated by most accounts in 1962 and subsequently developed in collaboration with the artist John McHale, the geoscope was envisioned as a tool of data visualization that would enable planning at the world scale. Intended as a device for visualizing large amounts of statistical information, what we would now perhaps refer to as geospatial big data, the geoscope was a pre-digital prototype of contemporary mapping software like ArcGIS or Google Earth. Users would enter a sphere, what Fuller called a miniature Earth, of approximately 200 feet in diameter, and find themselves immersed in an inverted globe, viewing the planet from inside out, as it were. Statistical information would be displayed on an array of 10 million light bulbs connected to a mainframe computer. In describing how this device could be used, Fuller wrote, "We could show all the population data for the world for the last 300 years. We would identify every 1,000 human beings by a red light located at the geographical centers occupied by each 1,000 human beings," end quote. So these lights would blink on and off. They would vary in intensity, change in color to depict different layers of information. The geoscope was a device that could provide humans with a total information integrating medium. This was Fuller's sort of phrase, his description. And while several prototypes of this device were built, including this one at Cornell, the project was never realized quite the way Fuller had envisioned it, in part due to the lack of sufficient computational capacity at the time. Fuller's pronouncements and his projects were complemented by his public persona, which was crafted in the mold of a technocratic prophet, a kind of seer of the future who combined techno-utopianism with a dose of mysticism, an image that he cultivated for decades through media appearances, interviews, writings, and so forth. He was both placeless and omnipresent, and was in some ways a true celebrity in our contemporary sense of that word. Over the course of his long career, Fuller developed and instrumentalized a habit of mind or a way of thinking that combined large-scale holistic thought with an understanding of design as a deeply tactile, hands-on material practice. So for example, in this image, you can see Fuller and a group of students constructing domes with discarded Venetian blinds. Always embedded within Fuller's work was an aspiration, admittedly naive, towards human liberation from conflict, stemming from outdated forms of identity, organized on the basis of nation states, economic class, and so on. Instead, what connected humans to each other was their shared dependence on the Earth's biosphere for sustenance and survival. The Earth was, for Fuller, a spaceship. Yet it was precisely this naive refusal to engage with seemingly obsolete political arrangements and ideologies that enabled Fuller to devise a system that appended dualisms of mind and body, of human life and geophysical material, and of thought and action. The pedagogical and practical experiments that stemmed from Fuller's vision were to become hallmarks of his work and perhaps his most abiding legacy. Fuller's iconoclasm and his eccentricities also meant that his highly technocratic and managerial ideas that often drew inspiration from early 20th century military found great appeal among post-war environmentalists and counterculture enthusiasts. It would also have a profound influence on the work of a generation of architects, including Charles Correa. In the late 1950s and 1960s, a number of cities in India witnessed the emergence of a small but influential group of architects and planners trained in the modernist tradition and deeply influenced by the work of Le Corbusier in Chandigarh. Charles Correa is perhaps the best known of this group. Trained as an architect and planner at the University of Michigan and at MIT, Correa returned to India in 1958, having completed his graduate studies in architecture a few years before. At both these institutions, Correa was taught by Fuller, first as an undergraduate at the University of Michigan, and then as a graduate student at MIT. In an essay titled Bucky, which was Fuller's nickname, Correa recounts his experiences working with Fuller. And I'm going to quote here. At Michigan, I recall it was to design domes for the radar stations being built within the Arctic Circle. Bucky's idea was incredibly simple. As a young naval cadet, he had noticed that the air vents on ships were usually surmounted by small louvered globes, so that as the sea winds swirled the blades of the vents around, air was sucked up out of the innards of the ship, from kitchens, boiler rooms, and so forth. What Bucky had conceived of for the Arctic Circle was not just his usual dome house, but a revolving dome house, with its surface made up of blades which could be angled to pick up the strong polar wind and thus spin faster and faster until the whole dome itself became invisible. In short, one would be using the forces of nature to make an invisible house. End quote. According to Correa, Fuller afforded architects the right to invent. The word invention here is meant to invoke the instrumentality of space as a resource or a kind of raw material, one that can be appropriated and apportioned to serve specific social, economic, and ecological needs. It is this instrumentality of space and of the spatial that provided for Correa the very condition of possibility for architectural design and planning. At the same time, Correa understood that invention was predicated on knowing what needed to be invented in the first place. For instance, he observed that in addressing the housing question in India and in the Third World more generally, architects were often too quick to design housing units instead of understanding why the system did not produce adequate housing in the first place. Our job, he said, is to understand the malfunction and to set it right. Fuller's concepts would go on to influence Correa's work, including his ideas about the future of urbanization in India and the developing world more generally. Already established as an important emerging architect by the mid-1960s, it was during this period that Correa also rose to prominence as an influential voice addressing the implications of urbanization and the growth of Indian cities. Like Fuller, Correa's thinking was in many ways ahead of its time. He was an early advocate of decentralized urban expansion, of comprehensive land use allocation guidelines, and of the necessity to rethink modernist tropes such as density and verticality in the context of rapidly growing metropolitan regions. Correa's work as an urban planner coalesced most vividly in his 1964 proposal with Praveena Mehta and Shirish Patel for New Bombay, or Navi Mumbai, a project that outlined a plan for the expansion of Mumbai to accommodate 2 million new residents in the form of rural migrants. A visionary plan for a growing city, it was adopted by the state government of Maharashtra in 1970. And soon after, the City and Industrial Development Corporation, or the CIDCO, was established to oversee the development of Navi Mumbai with chief architect, a position that he would hold from 1970 to the end of 1974. From the outset, Correa and his collaborators adopted an approach that was modern, yet highly conscious of the deficiencies of modernist planning in the context of post-colonial India. In his 1984 book, Correa described this comprehensive approach to planning as finding the new landscape. He wrote, "To find the new landscape, we must start with an overview. We must examine the entire system we call the city and try to identify those living patterns, those lifestyles, which are optimal in their totality, including roads, services, schools, transportation systems, social facilities, and of course, the housing units themselves. Only then will we be able to perceive how one can, in Buckminster Fuller's ineffable phrase, rearrange the scenery." Rearranging the scenery, however ineffable, belies the immense complexity of planning a city of 2 million people. Only a cursory reading of the 1964 draft plan by Correa, Mehta, and Patel is required to grasp its tactical intelligence. The authors recognized that population growth would exert tremendous pressures on the city's existing transportation, housing, and sanitation infrastructure. Consequently, they recommended the creation of new, smaller urban centers to relieve the pressures of an expanding city that was on the verge of becoming hypertrophic. So you can see in these diagrams from the draft plan, the basic sort of disposition of the development plan. In essence, Correa wrote, "We suggest opening up new growth centers across the harbor so that Bombay's north-south linear structure could change to a circular polycentered one." So in order to plan for population growth, the authors proposed a decentralized, polycentric, and multi-directional pattern of city growth that would absorb the harbor and extend the city across the harbor to the so-called mainland. It is entirely reasonable, I think, to consider Correa's use of the word landscape as a reformulation or even an extension of Fuller's notion of the scenery. The term "the scenery" was one of many terms in Fuller's heuristics that formed the basis of what he liked to call his design science. This was a form of knowledge that sought to transcend all political and economic ideologies in order to engender a truly universal design consciousness for the future. For Fuller, the scenery was the literal material of the world. It comprised those biogeophysical resources that could be technologically optimized to support population growth and to enhance human life on what he called our little spaceship Earth. Correa, on the other hand, was attuned to a different set of inputs derived from his experience as a practitioner grounded in the political realities of Mumbai and by extension of post-independence India. For Correa, the landscape comprised both the artifacts and the multi-scalar processes that enabled human habitation. From extant political arrangements to socio-economic structures, from provisioning infrastructure to the configuration of settlements. Only after examining this data, quote unquote, carefully, could a course of action be determined. So on the one hand, Correa's approach borrowed from, and in some ways built upon, Fuller's techno-utopian humanism. On the other, it purposefully addressed the political economy of urbanization, as well as the political machinations of the planning process itself. Perhaps this represented Correa's most significant departure from his teacher. Fuller's ideas often remained impracticable and unrealizable because of his naive idealism, and his scenery did not accommodate pre-existing political or economic arrangements. Correa, on the other hand, began from social and economic relations, from cultural practices and political arrangements, and often incorporated improvisation, incremental growth, and phasing in creative ways. And this project is a good example of some of these strategies in his work. Correa's collaboration with planners on Navi Mumbai and with a range of social scientists on the National Commission on Urbanization was a reflection of this attitude. Moreover, Correa's utopianism, and I'd argue that there was indeed a kind of utopian horizon of possibility that underpinned a lot of his work. So Correa's utopianism was tempered by his interest in the sociology of urban life, as well as his attention to situated knowledge and techniques. At the same time, Correa refused to submit to the easy dichotomy of the modern and the non-modern, or the traditional. For instance, his endorsement of high-density, low-rise models of urban development was not simply an appeal to the virtues of the vernacular or even of self-help, but represented for him the most optimal and robust pattern of development from a socioeconomic and cultural standpoint. One that could accommodate incremental growth, variation, flexibility, while supporting the hybrid, quasi-urban, quasi-rural forms of everyday life characteristic of post-colonial Indian cities. In this respect, Correa eschewed essentialism for a critical pragmatism. One might even say a critical realism, a quality overlooked by the narratives of vernacular and regionalism often used to characterize his work. And in fact, here I'd argue that Correa's writings on urbanization, on public housing, on infrastructure can be situated within a much longer tradition of critical inquiry on urban life under modern industrial capitalism. So this, depending on how one periodizes this could, start all the way from Engels on the housing question to Du Bois's urban ethnography to Lewis Mumford, all the way up to Manuel Castells, Peter Hall, and so on. So back to Navi Mumbai. There is little doubt that the original decision to implement the Navi Mumbai development plan was an outcome of the political valences of that time. In the decades that followed, the project was beset with many of the problems that would later become endemic to urban development in late 20th century India, including bureaucratic indifference, the elite capture of state institutions, and the emergence of a powerful real estate lobby. In 1993, Shirish Patel, one of the authors of the original plan, would write that government interest in New Bombay after starting it off has been minimal. In fact, Correa himself often spoke quite forcefully about the reasons behind the relative failure of the Navi Mumbai development plan. Despite the fact that it didn't materialize in the way it had originally been envisioned, the New Bombay development plan marked the beginning of Korea's lifelong engagement with the state of Indian cities and its relentless assertion of socio-economic justice and human dignity as the fundamental motivation for urban spatial practice. This conviction would be even more powerfully conveyed in his work as the chairman of the first National Commission on Urbanization in the 1980s. Correa's work on urban questions also situated the practice of architecture within an expanded social field, one that remained attentive to all those things Fuller had proclaimed unimportant or obsolete. So politics, political ideologies, social relations, cultural conventions, and so on. By way of conclusion, I'd like to read a short passage from the first chapter of the report of the National Commission on Urbanization, published in 1988. And I'm going to quote here. We have spoken much of urban patterns and spatial planning. It is time we turn our attention to the people who inhabit our towns and cities. Cities have wealth, but the poor who live in them do not share in it. They service the city, they clean the houses rich and cook for them, they provide labor for factories and shops, they are the main carriers of goods, and yet they continue to be poor. The transference of poverty from a rural environment, where it is well spread out over space, to a city where it is concentrated, presents perhaps the most horrifying images of independent India. If the preponderance of poor is taken as a concern on which urban planning should focus, the physical planning of our cities must change dramatically. End quote. This remarkable injunction remains, unfortunately, as urgent as it was in the 1980s. As we have all witnessed over the past few months, the devastating consequences of our unfolding planetary crises are distributed unevenly and experienced unequally, nowhere more so than in our cities. In this current phase of neoliberal capitalism, which operates in a particularly virulent form in 21st century India, Korea's reflexive method and the aspirations that underpinned it remain as important as they were 50 years ago. Thank you.
I'm deeply honored to be speaking on Charles Correa's 90th birthday. I sincerely thank Nandita and all at the Charles Correa Foundation. I'm also delighted to be here today with Ranjit and Swarnabh. I remember Charles Correa with deepest respect and admiration as a deeply committed thinker, an exceptionally talented architect, and dedicated planner. Although I met Charles periodically through my growing years, it's only when I read his essays in the book A Place in the Shade recently that I have begun to understand the depth of his understanding of Indian society and his focus on people-centric planning. These were all issues that were very close to his heart. Empathy, along with an inclusive vision for spaces, is what immediately struck me. We all saw this empathy and people-centric approach in the film that Charles made when he was still a student at the MIT. It immediately resonated with our work at SEBA and struck a common chord. One of my favorite buildings is the one that Charles designed at the Sabarmati Ashram. One of the walls in the building has a quote from Gandhiji's writings. I do not want my house to be walled in on all sides and my windows to be stuck. I want the culture of all lands to be blown about my house as freely as possible. But I refuse to be blown off my feet by any. The building that Charles created reflects this spirit. It is open on all sides and welcomes all to enter to learn about Gandhiji's life and message. 1,000,000 people from all walks of life and from all corners of the globe come to Sabarmati Ashram every year to understand the man and his message and perhaps to pay homage. I too am a frequent pilgrim, and as I walk through the building past the frangipani tree at the center, I am always at peace and very moved. Please, could you share the presentation now? Oh, having a little trouble with this. Evocative building, bringing the outside in and the inside out, is a perfect complement to Hriday Kunj, where Gandhiji lived and worked for many years. Across the river, near the historic Bhadra fort at the entrance to the walled city, is another building. It houses the Self-Employed Women's Association, SEWA, India's largest union of informal women workers. Founded in 1972 by Ila Bhatt, a lawyer and labor organizer, SEWA is inspired by the values of Mahatma Gandhi. Our history too is tied to his legacy. In 1918, Gandhiji and Ansuyaben Sarabhai led a non-violent strike for an increase in workers' wages and a bonus in the wake of the plague that struck Ahmedabad at that time. Together, they then founded the Textile Labor Association, or Majur Mahajan, in 1920. Ilaben Bhatt, founder of SEWA and the SEWA movement, was born into a family of freedom fighters. She joined the TLA in the 1960s and soon became the head of the women's wing. It was then that Supabai, a head loader in the main cloth market of Ahmedabad, came to her for help. She told Ilaben that she and her head loaders, the other head loaders in the market, were being paid a pittance by the wholesale cloth merchants in the market. They carried bales of cloth on their head or in their heart laris or handcarts. Ilaben often says it was Supabai and the other women who opened her eyes to the world of work of informal workers. particularly informal women workers, one of exploitation, injustice, exclusion, and poverty. Headloaders were among Seva's first members and continue to be so. Soon, a steady stream of informal women workers made their way to Seva. There was Chanda Ben, an old clothes vendor, and Suman Ben, a datan or toothbrush vendor, both of whom were founder members of Seva Bank. Unschooled, but smart and with plenty of life experiences and insights, these women and others joined hands with Ila Ben to form Seva Bank, and later many more membership-based organizations of the Seva movement. The planning for Seva and the growing movement was inclusive, participatory, and democratic from the start. Currently, informal workers account for more than 90% of the Indian workforce, or more than 500 million workers. As far as the female workforce is concerned, more than 94% are informal workers. Informal workers are poor, predominantly from socially disadvantaged castes and communities, and in the case of women, face gender discrimination at every step in our patriarchal society. Hence, taking a cue from Gandhiji's talisman of starting with the most vulnerable, Ilaben and the other early pioneers began organizing them into our union and later into cooperatives. Today, Seva is both a national union and a movement of 1.8 million women in 18 states of the country. We have learned that the first and most critical building block is organizing, the process of bringing women together, uniting them across caste, religion, language, geography, and other divides in our society, and building their solidarity. Class barriers are also surmounted as more middle-class women join the movement. Seva's members are street vendors, manual laborers like farmers and construction workers, service providers like waste recyclers, home-based workers like garment workers and incense rollers, and small producers like artisans and salt manufacturers. While their occupations may differ, they face many common challenges and struggles. Their lives are a constant quest for work and income security, food security, and social security. And social security in our experience means at least healthcare, childcare, insurance, pension, and housing with basic infrastructure like a tap and toilet in every home. The early years of organizing women were replete with lessons. There was no blueprint to follow. Very few had organized informal workers in the 70s. Access to financial services was one of the major barriers to economic empowerment. Banks were nationalized, but told women that they were unbankable. Chanda Ben, old clothes vendor and founder of Seva Bank, famously said, "We are poor, but we are many. Let us have our own bank." 4,000 women pooled their hard-earned money of 10 rupees at the time and approached the Reserve Bank of India for a license. After much cajoling and convincing of the RBI officer and learning how to sign their names, Chandaben, Sumanben, Ilaben, and others registered Seva Bank in 1974 as the first cooperative women's bank in the world. They were elected to serve on the board of the bank, and from the very start, decided all policies like interest rates, criteria for lending, and more. Organizing women workers was not at all smooth sailing. It still isn't. We learned that when demanding minimum wages for agricultural laborers in the nearby villages, or for coal or quilt makers in the Daryapur quarter of the old city, women faced all kinds of pressures and injustices from landlords, contractors, and even their own menfolk. Minimum wages were provided to landless agricultural laborers with the intervention of the Labor Department and Seva by day. But by night, the landlords took the money back from the laborers. In Daryapur, Karima Ben and Rahima Ben led the struggle for increase in wages for coal makers, whose own family members were underpaying them. Both these fearless leaders, also single mothers, were victimized by the contractors. It was then that Karima Ben suggested that they form their own unit and start working for themselves. They registered their cooperative Sabina and began working for themselves. They were now the users, managers, and owners of their own organization. This was in the late 1970s and was Seva's second collective enterprise after Seva Bank. Sabina flourished and more women were drawn to it like a magnet as they obtained decent work and income for the first time in their lives. Soon the contractors and merchants were forced to increase the wages they were offering to the women. We had intervened in the labor market with a strategy developed by the women and one that has remained with us ever since. The joint strategy of unions and cooperatives to build women's collective strength and bargaining power. The same strategy has also been effective in organizing landless laborers, artisans, and dairy farmers in rural areas. With alternative sources of work and income from dairy cooperatives and artisan collectives that they developed together, women became less dependent on landlords and exploitative contractors than ever before. My own journey at Seva began in the informal settlement of Shankar Bhuvan, almost 4 decades ago. This sprawling slum is a maze of dwellings located on the Sabarmati riverfront and was created about 100 years ago by migrant workers on a garbage dump. Most of the residents are from the Wagri community and are street vendors. Their 4 parents had migrated to the city. They are astute business people and sized me up in no time. If you are here like other educated people to tell us about family planning, you might as well taught me Garba and Gujarati and explained what exclusion and planning without people in the center was all about. First, being street vendors, they were regularly beaten and harassed by the police and the municipal authorities. They were evicted from the markets of the city, treated as petty thieves due to their caste, and made to pay huge sums to prevent confiscation of their goods and to avoid arrest. Second, their neighborhood had no toilets, no water supply, and no garbage disposal. Third, the women told me we have to have 4 to 6 children so that 2 to 3 survive. That was lesson number 1 of family planning from women's perspective. But there was more. The Ahmedabad Municipal Corporation had a special 90-10 scheme for building toilets, 90% subsidy by the municipal corporation, and 10% contribution from individuals. But the men and women of Shankar Bhuvan had no idea about the scheme, and much less idea how to access it. Fortunately, they all had bank accounts in Seva Bank, and they could take loans to pay for the toilets. These and other experiences in the city led us to form Mahila Housing Seva Trust, MHT, an organization committed to housing and basic infrastructure for informal women workers and their families. We worked with our local women leaders called Agevans in Gujarati to make the 90-10 toilet scheme actually reach women and got the local MLA, the member of the Legislative Assembly, to pay for the paving and street lights. These experiences and the bridges built between the women and the Ahmedabad Municipal Corporation officials was very helpful. And together we crafted Parivartan, a program to provide 7 basic services in informal settlements like Shankar Bhuvan, in situ and regardless of land tenure or patta. The services provided were tapped water, a toilet, garbage disposal, street lighting, paving, laying of sewage pipes, and stormwater drainage. Parivartan, literally meaning change, really took off and changed the face of 50 settlements in Ahmedabad and 12,000 households. Mahila Housing Seva, meanwhile, grew and began to provide other services, helping them to obtain legal tenure, legal electricity connections, and more. It also expanded to other cities in India and even overseas in Vietnam and Indonesia, to mention a few countries. When I watched Charles's film, I was struck how ahead of his times he was. He could not have known that at Seva we would discover the same solidarity model of revitalizing neighborhoods and planning with and by people themselves. Like him, we have learned the importance of organizing, bringing people together, building their solidarity, and starting with them in all planning, their ideas, their needs, and insights. We have seen again and again that when we have faith in local people, especially women, then the solutions emerge. There is churning, even disagreement and conflict. But eventually, most often, a path emerges that works for all. In the Parivartan program, in order to obtain the 7 services, every single household had to contribute 2,000 rupees, and the rest was contributed by the Ahmedabad Municipal Corporation and sometimes by the private sector. In order to lay down pipes and undertake paving, some homes had to give up a part of their dwelling. This was discussed in open meetings and practical solutions were found. In almost every settlement, there were very poor families or single women like widows who could not contribute. When we sat down to find a way forward, it was the women who said, if she cannot pay, then we will pay her share. We will divide up her contribution amongst ourselves. This decentralized planning and implementation for improving urban neighborhoods reaffirmed the importance and power of bottom-up planning. Unfortunately, the Parivartan story did not continue despite its effectiveness, and it has been replaced now by centralized planning and more top-down approaches. And it's not just about revitalizing urban neighborhoods, whether planning for microfinance or insurance or healthcare or livelihoods, the same lesson holds true. Start with women and the poorest and most vulnerable in the center of all efforts. Organize them and help them build their solidarity, and you will be on the right track. The second lesson we have learned all these years is the importance of collectives. Whether for tribal women or urban or rural women, organizing should lead to their own democratically run membership-based organizations. These may take several different forms depending on the need and context. We've experimented with unions, cooperatives, district associations, community-based organizations, and self-help groups, to mention a few. Initially, women may choose to work as an informal collective, but for long-term sustainability, formalization and registration is essential. It binds us together in good times and bad. We stress on membership-based organizations as this means that women pay dues or contribute a share, thus becoming owners of these organizations. Third, leadership must be in local hands, and we firmly believe, preferably in the safe hands of women. At Seva, we have seen, and during the COVID-19 pandemic too, that women are more inclusive and ready to take leadership even in the most trying of circumstances. During the pandemic, our Agevans not only provided immediate relief and support, but also said, let us make a list of the poorest and most vulnerable and give them food and health kits first. In Surat, when thousands of migrant workers ran out of money and food, it was women who cooked and fed them, even though their own resources were stretched to the limit. Fourth, when women leaders are given a place at the policy table, whether in Ahmedabad or in Delhi or at the International Labour Organization or elsewhere, they speak out fearlessly. Voice and representation of informal workers, especially women, in all policy making and planning is critical. It is not only authentic and convincing, but also shows the way for policymakers at all levels, from the local to the national and global level. Chanda Ben, the old clothes vendor founder of Seva Bank, once addressed 5 finance ministers in Delhi, including Dr. Manmohan Singh, then Finance Minister of India. She explained the intricacies of microfinance and why financial inclusion was essential for economic empowerment. Varsha Ben, a small farmer and health worker, was the keynote speaker at the Universal Healthcare Conference in Bangkok. And she explained lucidly how primary healthcare leads to poverty reduction. Aisha Ben flew to Dakar, Senegal, to tell her story and motivate informal workers there to form their own organization. And there are many more like them who have left national and international audiences spellbound by their clear thinking, articulation, and concern for the well-being of all. For all these women, life is never the same. Varshaben was honored in a public function by her community as the first person ever in her Thakur community to travel overseas. Aisha Ben was asked to stand for election in her municipal ward. The social and economic status of these Agevans, whether in their families or their communities, changes significantly. They are sought out and well respected. Fifth, Agevans bring their leadership talents to different committees and forums. Whether it's the school management committee in the village, or the village health committee, or the Mohalla Mahila Arogya Samiti, these women breathe new life into these committees. Once, when Seva was asked to revitalize local health committees in the villages, we turned to the Agevans. They not only turned these around, enabling constructive health action, like cleanliness drives and identifying malnourished women and children, but they also exposed corruption at the local level. Funds that went astray began to be put to use for the first time. Small gains, step by step, but important harbingers of change at the local level nonetheless. Sixth, when organized into membership organizations like cooperatives, it becomes easier for the outside world, like local authorities, to link up with women and local communities. During the current COVID-19 pandemic, our health cooperative Lok Swasthya Seva was asked by the local public health officers to assist them not only in providing health messages, but also in monitoring the situation at the grassroots and assisting possible cases to avail of further treatment, and also providing psychosocial care and counseling. They continue to work hard to dispel the fear and stigma associated with the virus. Further, Lok Swasthya had been running Seva Shakti Kendras, or literally empowerment centers, well before the pandemic. These centers have now become the hubs for relief and rehabilitation, and government officials have been coming there and providing pensions and other relief measures to local people through these centers and with the help of our Agevans. Yet another lesson that has emerged is that of sustainability. If we want our plans and programs to be sustainable in the long term, local people have to own these and run them as well. As part of Parivartan, each family contributed towards a community-based fund, which was used for maintenance and repairs. Decisions on the use of the fund was entrusted to a community-based organization located in the neighborhood, in the settlement itself. 2/3 of the members of this committee were women. They now call themselves Vikasini Bens, or literally women bringing development. This approach of community contributions as a step towards financial sustainability, along with governance structures which are democratic, decentralized, transparent, and accountable to the local community, is a common thread that runs through all of Seva's actions and the collectives we have developed. We have learned that when we start with our own contributions, Revenue and funds follow, either our own income that we raise ourselves or are provided by others or both. And slowly, our organizations become financially sustainable. Seva Bank today is a 300 crore women's cooperative bank with a board that is elected by its shareholders. Bimo Seva Cooperative, the first all-women insurance organization in the world, has a board with women from 5 states of India, along with insurance professionals. Asha Ben Ajmeri, a former garment worker and ACE Insurance Agavan, leads from the front as the president, always stressing on viability and carefully reading out the balance sheet at board meetings. The Seva journey is studded with many more life experiences and lessons. This organizing and solidarity approach has held us in good stead in every crisis, whether natural or human made. We have supported each other through the earthquake and through all kinds of crises like the communal violence in Ahmedabad. But today, perhaps we face the toughest challenge that all of us have faced so far, the COVID-19 pandemic upending the world as we know it. The pandemic is a health, livelihood, and humanitarian crisis rolled into one. It poses the severest challenges, not only to Seva, but to all of us. Here too, the lessons of collective strength and solidarity all these years have come to our aid. With a strong network at the grassroots level, we were able to act like a rapid action team, bringing immediate relief of food, health kits, and other essentials to those that needed it. Equipped with masks and sanitizers, the Agevans or the grassroots leaders thought of their neighbors first, often going hungry themselves. Being local, they could reach families quickly and provided much needed relief. They served people of all castes, communities, and faiths. They made sure no one was left out or left behind. Among the many lessons of the pandemic is that of partnership and dialogue. The pandemic has spared no country, no class of people or community. If we are to get through this, then we must do so together. That is the only way. It has shown us how interconnected we all part of the larger human family, where each of us must play our part with responsibility, caring, and compassion. It has also showed us how interconnected and interrelated we are with nature and the survival of our planet, and where the wanton exploitation of our resources, greed, and inequality has led us. The fault lines of every society lie exposed. Perhaps nowhere has this been more apparent and poignant than in our own country, India, home to the largest absolute number of low-income people on this planet. As we watched our fellow citizens trudge home with their meager belongings and no money, many of us not only felt their pain, but also were ashamed of our collective failure, a massive planning failure on our part. How could we not know that more than 90% of our people were informal workers and many of them were migrants? Why did we not invest in public health when we knew what we had to do? We knew we had to make those investments, but we postponed allocation of those. This is the time for reflection and action, not fault finding. We need to seriously begin the dialogue first with ourselves and then with others, whoever we are and wherever we are, about what kind of society and economy we want to create during and after this pandemic. This could be a time for change and constructive action to seriously address the challenges of inequality and inequity that plague India. It certainly is a time to think of ways to support and be in solidarity with our fellow citizens, no matter what we do and where we live. It is also a time to reflect on alternatives to the way we live our lives, so that we tread lightly and sensibly on our planet. Low-income people in our country rarely ask for handouts and doles. All they want is livelihood and access to basic services like healthcare and housing. They are famous for jugaad, doing more innovatively and inventively and with less. Many of them, and especially women, live close to nature and respect the earth's resources in a manner that some of us have forgotten how to do. We need to relearn from them and reset and refresh our strategies for life and living. We can do so by opening up channels for discussion, debate, and dialogue, and pool our strengths through partnerships. In Seva's experience, partnerships have been essential to keep us moving forward. Women from all different backgrounds have partnered in our movement, redefining sisterhood and the concept of family. One such partnership has been with the Ahmedabad Municipal Corporation, but it hasn't always been easy. When Ilaben, Lakshmiben, and other street vendors demanded space in the main market Manik Chowk of Ahmedabad, the women were met with eviction, arrest, and violence. When negotiations broke down, they filed a case in the Supreme Court of India over 3 decades ago, arguing for their right to livelihood. The court ordered that the status quo be maintained or a special market be created. Then the street vendor struggle, one of our signature urban campaigns for our rightful space in the market and also in the economy, developed into a national one. And 4 decades after the Manik Chowk struggle, the parliament passed a law in January 2014 for their protection and inclusion in all urban planning. From organizing street vendors into their union, to dialogue and negotiation with local authorities and the police, to legal action, policy and lawmaking, and back to organizing and dialogue when Ahmedabad was declared a heritage city. It is always a long road with twists and turns and ups and downs. Recently, street vendors worked with the Ahmedabad Municipal Corporation to plan for space in the heritage area of Bhadra with special demarcation for women vendors. The clincher was when women started their planning meeting with a Sarvadharam or all-faith prayer. The whole atmosphere changed to one of reconciliation and peaceful solutions. While the Bhadra heritage planning with vendors ended with a positive outcome, this was not the case when the corporation decided to convert Kankaria Lake, a public space, into a gated park with entrance fees. The children in our creches who live in crowded areas used Kankaria Lake with the zoo nearby as a favorite picnic spot. Padma Ben, manager of our childcare cooperative, and I rushed off to the municipal corporation. What kind of planning is this? We asked the standing committee chairman. Where will our children play? How can working class families afford these kind of entrance fees? We debated and discussed, but to no avail. The fortification of Kankaria Lake, the riverfront park, and other spaces continue on the pretext of beautification. Charles understood the importance of participatory and inclusive planning long ago, including public spaces for our children to play, to learn values of cooperation, tolerance, and sharing. His writings reveal a commitment to creative solutions based on dialogue and partnership, though at times he rues the lack of political will. We at Seva share this. In his convocation address to the graduating class of young architects in 1995 at the School of Architecture and Planning in New Delhi, Charles said, "Architecture and urban planning do not exist in a vacuum. They reflect and influence the social and cultural processes around them. It is from such manthan, such churning, that new ideas and new energies emerge. Surely we are in a time of manthan today as well." Charles wrote that if ever there was to be a Bill of Rights for housing, it would have to enshrine cardinal principles. incrementality, open to sky, equity, disaggregation, pluralism, malleability, participation, and income generation. He said these principles should be non-negotiable. These cardinal principles resonate with us at Seva as well, but we would like to expand these, as Gandhiji did long ago, to include truth, non-violence, equal respect and value of all faiths, castes, and genders, and Swadeshi, or promoting the local, whether employment, ideas, or approaches, and a respect for the environment. As we pay tribute to Charles Correa today, the architect, the planner, the humanist, and concerned and empathetic citizen, let us reflect on what each of us can do in our own ways to take forward the vision he laid out and the people-centered planning and action he invited us to take. Perhaps it is also fitting to recall Gandhiji's message to all of us, tucked away in his writings in the library of the building that Charles created. I will give you a talisman. Whenever you are in doubt, or when the self becomes too much with you, apply the following test. Recall the face of the poorest man or woman whom you may have seen, and ask yourself if the step you contemplate is going to be of any use to him or her. Will she gain anything by it? Will it restore him or her to a control over his or her own life and destiny? In other words, will it lead to Swaraj for the hungry and spiritually starving millions? Then you will find your doubt and yourself melting away. Thank you very much.
Ranjit, mute.
Can you hear me now? Today is Charles Correa's 90th birth anniversary, and I cannot think of a better way of commemorating his work and reflecting on the continuing relevance of his ideas than the two lectures we've heard today. I want to thank Nandita and the team at Z-Axis for this occasion, for inviting me to be part of it. And I want to thank our two speakers, Swarnabh Ghosh and Mirai Chatterjee, for the ideas they've shared. Because through these two lectures, we've really been invited to consider the two great aspects of Charles Correa as a utopian visionary, an architect, and a planner. On the one hand, there's the planetary and even cosmic scale at which he situated humankind and its interactions and its aspirations. And on the other hand, there was his close engagement with the granularity of place, of neighborhood, of community, and politics. It's as though the cosmic machine on the one hand and the granularity machine on the other came together this evening in the two lectures we heard. And I was also, as discussant, I have to say how much I enjoyed the fact that the two lectures took such very different forms. Swarnabh's lecture was really an essay in intellectual biography. It engaged with a history of ideas and contextualized Charles's work in ways that I will briefly comment on as I go along. And Mirai's presentation, Mirai's lecture, took the form of the portrait of an organization or of a movement. which resonated very, very strongly with some of Charles's key concerns. If the presiding spirit of Swarnabh's lecture was Buckminster Fuller, Mahatma Gandhi was the presiding spirit of Mirai's. And as I've been thinking about these lectures, it strikes me that Mahatma Gandhi, Buckminster Fuller, and Charles Correa were all, in Anna Akhmatova's phrase, guests from the future. Many of you will be familiar with this occasion in the life of the great Russian poet, Anna Akhmatova. She met in 1945 Isaiah Berlin, who was visiting from the UK. Remember that Akhmatova lived under extreme constraints under the Stalinist regime. She had very little access to friends or colleagues, certainly not visitors from abroad. And she spent 14 hours in conversation with Berlin. And he brought back into her life the hopes and dreams of openness, of dialogue, of exchange, of cosmopolitanism, a world she had known and a world that she hoped would come back into existence. And really what lies at the heart of that episode, for which Akhmatova paid deeply, but held on to that hope. What lies at the heart of this meeting, this encounter, is this question: what kind of society do we want to shape? What would its values be? And Akhmatova referred to Berlin as her guest from the future. And I want to hold on to that as a trope for this evening, because it also gives us a way of thinking about how Charles drew on a horizon of thought that was present. He drew on, critically engaged with traditions that were present to him, but also extrapolated thought in utopian, even futuristic terms, and really saw the work of the architect and the planner as closely wedded to questions of equity and social justice, to questions of communities and community formation, and also to questions of the ecology. The larger environmental planetary questions were very, very present to him. So I want to now annotate and respond to the individual lectures and then open up the floor to questions. I'll begin with Swarnabh's lecture. As you were speaking, Swarnabh, I was struck by, first let me say how captivated I was by your characterization of Charles as a critical realist or a critical pragmatist. It really conveys his ability to shuttle between Buckminster Fuller's, again, as you characterized Fuller's stance, an almost quasi-religious belief in the power of design to shape and transform experience, irrespective of all the particularities of nation states, societies, and asymmetries. It set me thinking of Correa essay that's been very, very important for me, certainly in my thinking on this subject, Learning from Eklavya, where he takes as his exemplar or protagonist someone who's outside the pale of society, who studies not with a flesh and blood guru, but with the effigy of a guru, and then is made to pay dearly for having transgressed the canon of who can receive education and who must remain forever outside the pale of education. But in the process of discussing Eklavya, as you know, of course, he draws out two different models of what a studio, what an architectural studio might be. He describes the first kind as the guru studio, where the student learns to imbibe and assimilate everything that the guru has to offer from his own or her own experience and insights. And the other kind of studio is the distancing studio, where criticality and questioning and moving away from received traditions becomes important. So there's continuity on the one hand, and there's criticality on the other. And as the essay proceeds, we realize that what is being conveyed is that the architect must combine both the advantages of training and the advantages of being an autodidact. And for him, for Correa, Eklavya is really that figure who combines both training and autodidacticism. And again, I felt, Swarnabh, both in your lecture and Mirai in yours, I felt this sense of an empirical, a heuristic, a discovery-based approach that did not throw away what had been inherited. That came across so very strongly. So, Swarnabh, thank you for also situating Bucky Fuller as such an important figure in Correa's own evolution and his intellectual biography. It set me thinking of a number of other projects and initiatives of the 1960s, which peaked really in the early 1970s. And I think we might usefully expand from the figure of Fuller to see if these other figures were also important to Charles. In other work that I've been doing in that period, I find, for instance, that Gregory Bateson, the anthropologist and pioneer of cybernetics, stands out as a kind of key figure of that period. In his, particularly, I'm thinking of his work, Mind and Nature, in which he talks of how there has to be a necessary unity between the supposedly sovereign human mind and its needs and what it owes to the larger ecosystem. I'm thinking here also of Ivan Illich, Deschooling Society, and Paulo Freire, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, books that emerged from work done in the late 60s and early 70s, of course. But what role might these thinkers have played in Correa's development? This is something I hope you'll take up as we go into the discussion. I'm also thinking of Stuart Brand's Whole Earth Catalog, which has that image of spaceship Earth. And again, this was all part of the great intellectual ferment of the late 60s and 70s. In thinking about Charles thus far, I've occasionally thought of these figures, but it's only as I'm speaking now that I see how strangely he was part of the counterculture. Or was he? It's a question I put to you. And Mirai, I'm going to really dwell on the way in which you built a bridge between your own immense engagement with the marginal and the vulnerable, and what you characterized as Correa's people-centric planning. How the forms of organization, the kinds of negotiations you've had to conduct with a larger society that is still very much expressive of patriarchy, of caste, of gender asymmetries, how there's so much in common between your work and the kind of work Charles thought through and the kinds of contexts he dealt with. And here again, I find a certain connection between the two lectures today, because Swarnabh, you also spoke of how we could situate Charles in a tradition of thinking about housing, labor, density, more equitable planning of cities, a tradition that includes Engels, Mumford. You didn't mention Geddes, but I'm assuming Geddes would play a role in this, all the way to Manuel Castells. And I might even think here of how some of the thinking Saskia Sassen has been doing about the enclosure of cities and the great expulsions. I think Charles prefigured that in, for instance, in The New Landscape and in other writing of his from the 70s. Mirai, I'm also thinking of how, for instance, throughout your presentation, we were reminded forcefully of how, when we think of Charles, it's not just the great built form, the visionary open to sky voids and the ritualistic pathway and all of these features that we recognize and love in his architecture. The non-glamorous side of his work was also his insistence and his preoccupation with services, with amenities, with what is it that makes places livable? What is it that includes people by not cutting them off from sources of water, from electricity, from greenery in what might otherwise be an urban wastescape? And here again, I think, for instance, about The New Landscape, where he goes into these questions. And there's an evocative drawing in The New Landscape, which many of us will know here, where he talks about how Bombay streets could be modified with a line of platforms 2 meters wide and half a meter high, with water taps at 30-meter intervals. And he writes, during the day, these platforms will be used by hawkers, thus clearing the arcades for pedestrians. In the evening, water from the taps would wash the platforms clean, creating otlas for people to sleep on. So the informal city, the city of night, the city of the homeless and the vulnerable, is as important to this architect visionary as the more, if you will, registered and legal users of public space. It seems like an extraordinary detail to think about, how to repurpose pavements so that those who have no place in a city of the rich, of capital, how they might also find a place, marginal as they are. And I want to really conclude by thinking about how, for Charles, architecture and planning were modes by which to resist the asymmetries of power that have been coded over the centuries into society, into politics, into the public sphere, and eventually into built form. And his concern really was how architects and planners might propose and make possible more inclusive forms of decision making, forms of organization, and community formation. So there's an immensely participatory, democratic model to his thinking about these questions, to how he thought of housing, how he thought of urbanization, and how eventually he thought about potential solidarities. And I'll end my part of this really by reading a small passage from The New Landscape, because it's a caveat, it's a cautionary tale that we should take with us into this present and future that's shaped by the pandemic and by the lockdown. And Mirai, as you rightly said, it's exposed the fault lines in every society. So we have to rededicate ourselves to how to confront those fault lines. And here is Charles from The New Landscape. It's a passage where he's pointed out that fewer than 2%, less than 2% of society can actually engage the services of an architect. And then he says, and I quote, "This figure represents the people who commission the office buildings, apartments, luxury hotels, factories, and houses that make up the bulk of the architect's practice. The situation is not to the architect's making. It merely reflects the grotesque inequality within society itself. But of course, it is the poor whose needs are the most desperate. Today in Rio or Lagos or Calcutta, there are millions living in illegal squatter colonies. Can the architect, with his highly specialized skills, find a way to be of relevance to them? For what these communities need is not only our compassion, but our professional, that is, our visual and topological skills. Without these, the squatter colonies will turn out to be nightmares, proliferating over the next few decades on a scale that boggles the mind. In turn, they will maim whole generations of third world children, condemned to grow up in such environments." This is Charles Correa writing in the 70s. And this is exactly the path that we've gone down. So again, the question I would have for you, Mirai, would be, in your own work, could I draw you out more on how you've engaged with architects and what your sense has been of the responsiveness of architectural practitioners to these questions? So
I'm thinking of two examples from our experience. One is, of course, our favorite example of street vendors. We are fortunate to live in the city of Ahmedabad with the School of Architecture just across the river. And we've had lots of architecture students who have come with us, sat with the vendors, discussed with them, and helped in the planning, including in the latest planning of the heritage area in Bhadra that I spoke of. So I think it's been a happy collaboration. It's been a mutual learning, I'd like to think. They shared cups of chai, tea with the street vendors. And I think important bonds were forged on both sides. Another example is in some of our work on housing, low-income housing. One of the things I didn't mention is that now SEVA has started a low-income housing company which gives loans to women, longer-term loans, obviously, because SEVA Bank can't give long-term loans. And it's called Sitara. And we work with young architects who help women actually design the kind of homes that they would like and they would need. And they're not the kind of homes that I'm sorry to say, our planners have come up with, which is high rises and people who keep small animals, even in our cities, like in Ahmedabad, many people keep goats and chickens. It's very common in Shankar Bhavan. So, that kind of dwelling isn't suited to their needs. So these young architects have been working with them, see how homes can be designed within their budgets, but in a proper way that suits their lives, their work, and their reality.
Because it also suggests a process of mutual education, in a sense. And whilst there's an emphasis on the architect as a somehow privileged contributor in the writings that I've been reading from, there's also, I think, a very strong awareness in Charles's writing that there is a learning that comes the other way, from experience, from unexpected interlocutors. So I'm going to pass on to Swarnabh with these thoughts. Swarnabh, could you maybe address those questions that I had for you earlier about sort of intellectual context that one could elaborate for Charles?
Yeah, thank you, Ranjit, for those wonderful comments. There's obviously a lot to think about here. There's a lot of material. There are a lot of connections that can be traced between Correa's thinking, his sort of the period in which he was intellectually socialized, to put it one way. And I think the Bateson connection. So there's broadly, the way I think of this is broadly two strands of radical or revolutionary or countercultural thought in the 60s and 70s. So one is very much let's say the kind of ecological utopian vision that Fuller represented, and to some extent Bateson, in my view, is a thinker of that sort. So if that's one, then there's the other, let's say, stream, and there are many more streams, but I'm pulling from the names that you cited. And it's interesting, Paulo Freire was in some ways a philosopher of education, right? His most famous text, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, I think it's called, was a response to Fanon's work, and specifically a response to The Wretched of the Earth. And so the background to Freire's work is very much a kind of deep-seated disdain or a kind of kind of skepticism toward, let's say, bourgeois forms of standardized education. So this is what Freire was always arguing against. But he approached it from a kind of radical Christian socialist standpoint, right? Very different from Fuller's kind of, let's say, almost, kind of, I don't even know how to describe it, a kind of non-grounded, a very consciously non-grounded approach to solving the problems of the planet, right? And Fuller often even exceeded the limits of our planet. Like he has these writings, he has a book called 9 Chains to the Moon, which is basically a text that in some ways is imagining a post-planetary future. And what's interesting about Correa to me is that he in some ways brings, and it's a little bit cliche to say this, but he does in some ways bridge that gap on the one hand, because there is this utopian core in a lot of his writings and a lot of his thought as they relate to the social and cultural context of South Asia. But then there is a kind of hard-nosed criticality that in some ways gives him or discloses for him the horizons of possibility, right? In other words, the thing that is to be planned for is very much for Correa based on what he observes and what he sees in his life as a young architect and planner practicing in Mumbai. So in some ways, I think that's the sort of, that hybridity is what I'm interested in. And I think it also is interesting in another sense, which is that a lot of Correa's architectural work gets described, as being somehow localist or as being a kind of regionalist, critical regionalism famously. I mean, Correa was an example of the great critical regionalist. And I think while those narratives are obviously, extremely well considered and they have resonances with his architectural work, I wanted to, in some ways, emphasize that other, we can call it a more radical, a more utopian dimension to his work on urban questions. And Henri Lefebvre has this beautiful line in one of his less prominent texts, and the line is something like, "There is no plan without utopia." And this is Henri Lefebvre, who is in some ways the dean of radical, critical, Marxist urban sociology. So even Lefebvre in some ways recognized that being highly critical was not in some ways the opposite of being utopian. I think the impulses behind being very critical about what one observed, and in some ways always deriving one's plan of action from what one was analyzing, was did not obviate a kind of a deep utopian core. Yeah, so I think I'll leave it there for now, but I just tried in some ways to connect the various figures that you cited. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Swarnabh. No, it's precisely this that these are the two things that really stood out for me. One is the need to really develop a more, if you will, transcultural context for Correa and his ideas, because it's there. And in thinking about figures of his generation, I've also felt that we tend to constrain them within a sort of nationalist conception of history, and we have to open out to see the larger contexts, and certainly the larger intellectual contexts that these figures were part of. So thank you for that. I'm now going to move on to the questions that have been coming in. So we'll start with this. Let me begin with a question from Puneet to Mirai. The question is legal ownership the biggest hurdle in delivering social housing and public spaces? How can a capitalistic society deliver equity in urban space?
Tough question. Two comments. First and foremost, our experience with Parivartan has shown that regardless of tenure and patta, you can do urban renewal, you can lay in those pipes and water and toilets. And slowly, what we see is that communities regenerate and also spend on their own housing bit by bit. And what I love is the women often say, now we don't live in an informal settlement. Now we are living in a housing society. So that's point number one. I think the second point I'd like to make is that we feel very strongly about in situ urban renewal and housing. There's been a tendency in India for moving people. Even when the Sabarmati Riverfront project came, large numbers of people, including my friends at Shankar Bhavan, were moved far down. Of course, they got houses that they would never have, perhaps they said so. They said we got flats that we would never have dreamt of. But it was too far away. And as I said, they also keep small animals and so on. And that didn't really fit with their reality. So those are some issues. The second set of issues on the legal part, I mean, quite frankly, I think those are very difficult issues and I don't have answers for those, I'll be honest. But we have been working with different municipal corporations across the country, especially my colleagues in Mahila Housing Seva, and trying to see how we can work on this issue of land tenure. And importantly, patta and tenure given at least in the joint name of both the woman and the man of the household. So I know I haven't answered fully because I'm not really a qualified housing specialist, but these are some of the experiences that we've had.
Thank you, Mirai. Swarnabh, there's a question for you from Anne. How different were the ideas of Fuller's, of course, rearranging the scenery, and Correa's The New Landscape? And where does You and Your Neighborhood factor in?
I think the difference is my lecture in some ways articulated some of the differences, or what I think are some of the key differences, right? One is, again, to reiterate, the sort of situatedness of Correa's work in some ways derives from the way in which he observed things around him, right? This is not to say Fuller did not observe things around him, but the in some ways the horizon for Fuller was very different in some ways from the horizon that motivated and guided Correa. So I'll leave that question there. I mean, that the first part of that. You and Your Neighborhood, I think, is a wonderful early example of this very characteristic of Correa's work. I think it beautifully, in some ways, illustrates the ways in which he thought about, urban questions, the housing question, questions around sociality and habitation. And I think the film, in some ways, captures that really well in a very early and in a somewhat self-conscious fashion. And that is something I kind of appreciate about that film. It's done as a kind of graduate thesis project, and it reflects in some ways that kind of that type of, I would call it unself-conscious work. And of course, then if you look at the writings on urbanization and on urban development that follow in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and if you actually take a look at the National Commission on Urbanization report, which I think is a remarkable document for its time and for its purpose, it was a federal level, as it were, body that was coming up with a kind of long-term vision for urbanization. And again, if you read those documents, you can see aspects of this type of thinking, I think, running like a red thread. I mean, from the Navi Mumbai draft plan all the way through to the National Commission on Urbanization. And the last thing I'll say on this is that there's a kind of reflexivity that I also really admire and appreciate in a lot of Correa's work, which basically means that he was very quick to admit when things didn't work. I mean, he was, in fact, himself one of the strongest critics of what Navi Mumbai had turned into. 2014, he was sort of saying that, look, this is not the thing that we had envisioned. And if you look at, again, the report on the National Commission, the report of the National Commission on Urbanization, you'll see in there like learnings from his experience and the experience of his collaborators on Navi Mumbai. And so they're in some ways learning from the mistakes or from the failures of that project, and in some ways adjusting their work.
Yeah, that's a classic feedback loop trope favored by the kind of information thinkers in the 50s and 60s who were also part of the background to Correa's ideas. That kind of leads directly to a question that we have here from Sarosh, which I'll put to both of you. Is there any scope for restituting or restoring the public architect who works within and with the public sector, as Correa did? Mirai, do you want to take that first? I mean, you've already talked of this, but maybe in a more definite kind of way, has that space been ceded or vacated now?
I don't think so. I think we are always so full of hope when we see the young architects from across the river come across and want to join hands and experience. Maybe they won't be a public architect all their lives, but we do find that many of them do want to contribute their skills, do want to learn. And also the kind of issues that are thrown up in informal settlements or in our markets are so very challenging. They're intellectually challenging as well. What can you do to accommodate, and also with less resources? So I think there is a space for public architects, and we look forward to working with more of you.
Swarnabh, do you want to respond to this?
Yeah, maybe I'll offer a somewhat less optimistic response to this. I think for there to be a public architect, you need a public sector, and I think one of the features of what we call neoliberalism is that it involves a kind of evisceration, a planned evisceration of the public sector, and this is happening in India, but it's also happening in other so-called third world countries. Brazil is another good example. So yeah, so I don't know. I think you need a public sector for there to be a public architect. I think if I understand Sarosh's question, he's referring to to sort of actually public architects that are working for public sector organizations, high level bodies, often constituted at the national level. And I think that is sorely lacking. And I think that is becoming more and more, it's becoming more and more clear that that is absolutely fundamental. I spoke of planetary crises, in the plural. The pandemic is only the most recent manifestation of a much longer and a much more slow kind of crisis, which is the climate emergency. And I think to respond to these kinds of crises, we will need solidarity models, to use Mirai's phrase. We will need solidarity models across nation states. Again, goes back to the kinds of things that Fuller was talking about. And I think in some ways architects, I think architects and planners and thinkers about space urbanization have a role to play. But I think we need to find those models of solidarity across nation states, across regions, for that to work.
This connects, Swarnabh, with another question we have here from Anushka, which is in the context of Fuller's writing specifically. What could the amalgamation of technology and socially sensitive planning processes mean for present-day India? Is there an existing model that addresses this? It kind of flows from your point just now. Would you want to take that?
I'll say something quick about this. So, like a good critical social scientist, I will say that technology can mean many things to many people, and I think Correa recognized this. I think in a way that was somewhat more sophisticated than Fuller. For Fuller, technology was very much the way we conventionally think of technology in the post-war period. So he was highly inspired by kind of advancements in military technology, by space exploration, by space flight. Correa, on the other hand, was not, and I would insist on this, was not a person that, issued technology or was in some ways a localist, a sort of traditionalist in this way. He, in fact, had I would say, a fairly technologically attuned understanding of things like, building typology, for instance, right? So for him, the courtyard model was not simply a model that was good because it existed in South Asia and because it was in some ways culturally produced. It was that, but it was also very much for Korea a kind of optimized, platform in some ways for the kinds of urban living that were becoming very, very common in Indian cities. And again, Mirai mentioned, people in Ahmedabad, people in Delhi, in these large metropolitan regions, often live lifestyles that cannot be classified urban in the sort of conventional Western industrial capitalism sense. These are sort of agrarian urban hybrids. Often, subsistence farming goes along with living inside a city. So these are the types of things I think that often require solutions and thinking that adopt critical approaches to technology, which is to say that technology is not simply machines and electricity and energy, but it can also mean very simple ways of organizing the built environment, of organizing space, of working with cheap materials, of thinking about time and temporality, and so on.
Thank you for that, Swarnabh, because again, it reminds us of how just as modernism and modernity are not a single thing all over the world, it's not a universally executable program, nor is urbanization. What a city is, what it could be, how it's been conceived, has been different in different societies. So that's something we tend to overlook. And I think we also overlook it when we think about Indian modernism in a certain sort of way. We really have to unpack that much, much more. And these are ways. Incidentally, I'm sounding like a bibliography today, but Ernst Schumacher, "Small is Beautiful," is someone else who comes to mind, because these questions that we were just discussing also have to do with technology and scale.
For somebody like Fuller, technology operated in the same way at every scale, like some kind of, frankly, like a bludgeon. But as you said, Charles's understanding of it was finely tuned, different kinds of technologies, in fact, at different scales. So,
yeah. I mean, just to add a footnote to your point, I mean, climate is another thing, right? That a lot of Indian quote unquote modernists were extremely careful about, actually. I mean, contrary to the reputation of modernist international style buildings in a place like Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I'm sitting right now, where, you know, there's, you often joke about how, oh yeah, these, you know, modernist buildings from the 30s and 40s are so just miserable in some ways climatically, right? They get really, really hot, they get really, really cold. They do not often have the types of insulation that, you know, traditional buildings here would have. But in India, so when modernism arrives and sort of evolves in India, it always evolves from this position of being deeply conscious and deeply attentive to the specificities of climate. And I think you can see this sort of across the board, I think, in the 60s and 70s with that generation of Indian architects.
We now have a question, Anthony Dessar. How can public institutions be sensitized to commission work that fulfills visionary ideas such as the ones we're speaking of? Mirai, could I invite you to take that?
Sure. Unfortunately, all these years, public institutions and private maybe, our experience has not been very rosy. Many a time they have failed us. I mentioned the banking sector. We were told we were unbankable. Then when we knocked on the doors of the insurance companies, which were nationalized, we were told you're bad risk. So our experience with public institutions has been really rather mixed, to say the least. But I think I'm less familiar with public institutions to do with building. But as I mentioned, public institutions, if there's more dialogue, if there's more interaction, and we do see some of those spaces opening up, I must say, after almost 50 years of Seva, we do see those spaces opening up. A recent example from my own experience is the Insurance Regulatory and Development Authority of India. Who would have thought that they would be in dialogue with women and planning microinsurance and be ready to come to informal settlements and observe the kind of risks that women and their families are going through? But they did. They came, and there was a mutual exchange, and it was enriching. And the net result of that was a microinsurance committee, which has just submitted its report to the IRDAI, and hopefully there'll be change. So my experience of public institutions are like this. Of course, there are many more public institutions whose bastions, Chanda Ben and others would say we have to storm in and have more of a dialogue and debate. But I think I would say compared to 50 years ago when we started out, there are more openings today. And maybe we would say it's because of the power of organizing, because of our collective strength. Otherwise, who would give us a look in?
Thank you for that response, Mirai, because it also reminds us of how, for what it's worth, this republic has had a tradition of dialogue between public institutions and actors from other parts of society. And that is one of the many things that seems to be under assault today. So how do we, there's kind of push-pull between strong, centralizing, top-down kind of approach and the kind of work that you stand for, that you've done, which is from the ground up, from the grassroots, self-organizing. And it's to be hoped that that kind of dialogue continues instead of falling by the wayside. So this is something that maybe we should, do we have any more questions? I think that we've. So what I'm going to do now at the end of this is, for my part, thank both of you, Mirai, Swarnabh, for an absolutely marvelous discussion, for the ideas you've put into play, and for the thoughts you've undoubtedly provoke, the journeys of thought onto which you've invited all of us here. I certainly enjoyed it, and I'm sure I speak for our audience across the globe as well. And I'm now going to hand the mic, so to speak, back to Nandita to bring this session to a conclusion. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank all of you for a really wonderful discussion. The two presentations were outstanding, both the lectures, and Ranjit, as always, sort of has a fantastic way of, really remarkable way of sort of being, provocative and yet bringing it all together. And I think perhaps, what we are left with is what do we want our society to be? We've seen the different aspects, and I think our cities and our neighborhoods reflect society. And for that reason, we are looking at, spatial organization. What are our cities about, all the way down to the neighborhood level. And that's what the next 4 sessions are going to be. So this has been a wonderful way of bringing in, these very different sort of perspectives and folding them in, and really it's happened so fantastically. I'm just like waiting to now go on to the next things. But thank you all, all 3 of you have really done an amazing job. I want to just end with being able to thank people who have really brought this all together. And if you could just go to, I just have a couple of slides that I need to run through. Yeah. So really, I would like to thank, on behalf of the foundation, the donors who helped with their generous contributions, from the A.T. Chandra Foundation, who have really believed in us and have been so supportive, to stalwarts like Dutta Naik, who supported the Charles Correa Memorial Lecture since 2016, the Raza Foundation, Siddhartha Goa, who have supported us at every Z-axis till now, and to Titan, Okai, the Vasantrao Dempo Foundation, Harsh Nyotia, Shapurji Palanji Group, and old friends like Suchita and Viral Doshi, Cyrus Gazda, Madhukar Kera, and other friends who have chosen to remain anonymous. But thank you all, everyone. This year, your contributions have been especially appreciated, as we know just how difficult it has been. There's just so much to be done, so much to really, for us as societies, just to have to deal with. I would also like to thank the entire team at the foundation, who have put in a huge effort to make it all possible. I was not able to get to Goa, where I would have been camped for the last 4 or 5 weeks to get something like this together. But, they have just been remarkable. Tahir Narona, the convener, for all the effort he has put in, Parshiv Shetu, who's a fellow at the foundation, and the others, Anisha Panvelkar, Vaibhav Kol, Chinmay Soman, and to Sogam too, who I would, just like to thank you. The logistics this year were really daunting to my mind, and so many thanks. And to the trustees of the foundation, and especially to Monica and Arminio for all their support. So thanks everyone. Thanks to everyone who has logged in, and for participating, for the ones who are going to continue and participate in the design competition, and to bring about change in our cities and neighborhoods. So we look forward to seeing you all again on Saturday. This Saturday is coming Saturday, September 5th at 6 p.m. Indian Standard Time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.